Trigger warning. This episode discusses sensitive topics which some viewers may find disturbing.
What makes us so lethal in war is the fact that you can shoot us and we are still going to fight because our corpsmen and our medics can just patch us and we keep running. We should be able to do the same mentally. I don't expect them to learn to shoot in the middle of combat. I expect them to learn everything about this prior. They can still operate this weapon system because they've done it over and over again in training. I want the exact same thing done with the brain.
There are commanders who come in, here's the mission, here's everything, all this other stuff. And they're so driven by the desire to be successful, which is totally understandable, that they miss the opportunity and they miss the necessity. It all boils down to connection. And it's not a cute and cuddly term. And if you don't have it, you are not going to have an effective squad or company or battalion or just go all the way up.
Welcome to the Red Banners Podcast, where I bring together a variety of experts in the field of helping you live a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. With us today is David Woods-Bartley and Mike Murphy. David is a suicide survivor turned mental health advocate. He's been featured on multiple TED Talks and spends much of his time working with military leaders to improve culture around military mental health and what he terms life preservation. Mike is a former Force Recon Scout sniper who is now a psychiatric mental health nurse and advocate. He leads several DoD-wide initiatives focused on building resilience by prioritizing prevention, developing mental health skills early, and strengthening support before those skills are needed. Both bring some amazing experience to the real-world issue that we're dealing with today. Mike and David, thank you so much for being here. Could you give us a little bit of background on your interaction with military mental health and your perspective, where you come from and what you're currently working on? David, would you mind going first, and then Mike?
Sure. No, thanks. Well, it's an honor to be here. Great to connect with both of you again, because you both are, in my mind, heroes and mentors to me. So I am a suicide attempt survivor. And while I've not served in the Army, I have had the great honor to brief quite a bit all over the world. My commitment comes to the Army in particular, without having anything negative to say about the other organizations. My eldest brother, when we lost our father, I was just 7, he was 18. He really stepped in as my dad, and he did 42 and a half years in the Army, having enlisted in 1970, ultimately made his way to West Point, graduated in a somewhat very famous class of 76, and then ultimately pinned on 2 stars. And so I've lived on post and had an experience in the Army even before I went through my own trials and tribulations and near-death experience with mental illness and then a suicide attempt. And since then have made my way, as I like to say, from mental illness and mental wellness. And in my present work with the military, it's different. And I'm really cautious to not have criticisms or anything negative to say on the established systems that have been long taught. But I do believe that it's time for a change. And the primary thing is I'm not a fan of suicide prevention. I really don't think it works. And the change that I've advocated for most recently with thousands of soldiers in the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea was to ask them, what is that thing that if you're in a boat that you put on if seas get rough? And of course they say, well, I put on a life preserver. Exactly. But so isn't it interesting that they don't call it an anti-drowning jacket? And when you get in your car, you don't put on an anti-crash belt, you put on a safety belt. And the 3 of us, we don't have death insurance, we have life insurance. So in other words, there's an affirmation in the term for what is wanted, and yet we don't do that with suicide. And so I tell soldiers up front 4 things, and this is really where my briefs go, that this is not a brief on suicide prevention, it's a brief on life preservation. And it's not just a cute change in a name, it's actually the difference between trying to stop something from happening and advocating something to continue. And then also to move away from this whole notion, suicide is never going to make sense. And so I tell people, if you want this brief to help you to make sense out of suicide, I'm not your guy. But I am your guy to help you understand it better, because the opposite of fear isn't calm. The opposite of fear is understanding. The more we understand, the less we fear. And then ultimately that we have long taught certain signs to look for, they basically don't exist. And I'm going to ask you to make a change in regard to that. And the final thing is, we really don't know who's at risk. And so the TTPs, the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures I teach soldiers are all to be applied to everybody. because ultimately we're gonna impact the person who needs it in that moment. So that's my stuff in as short as I can, but I will pass it to my brother who is far more versed in these things than I am.
I don't know about that. So, yeah, we discussed in the last podcast. I was a prior force recon scout sniper. Did several. I started in the infantry and the Marines. Went over to force recon. Did several combat deployments, and how I kind of dealt with a lot of things was just to power through and get through them. I never really looked at that as a problem. I thought that was kind of my superpower, that, hey, I'm emotionally numb. I don't really feel things. I'm not affected by things. And that's what everyone around me saw. But what the reality was when I went home, those were the people that were actually seeing what was really going on with the drinking and the irritability and the anger and the social, just avoiding social situations. And so I stepped back and said, "Okay, I I think that the organization is the problem, not me, right? Everybody else has a problem with my drinking. I don't have a drinking problem," was kind of what I would go around saying. So I had crossed over and I went into the Navy with the hopes of doing anesthesia. So it was a nurse anesthetist program. So they send you to nursing school. And when I'd finished that program, that's when everything really fell apart. Like, nothing got better, everything got worse. I had lost my whole social network. I was drinking more than I had ever drank. My family left. They had enough. They gave me the ultimatum on, should you, choose drinking or choose us, and I certainly chose drinking, and so they left, and I was just at a really bad place. And luckily, instead of attempting suicide, I was one of the few that reached out to a friend for help against everything that I ever was taught or believed. You never give up, you never quit, you never surrender. But I had to. And so I threw the towel in and I called a friend and I need help. And fortunately, the friend that I called was in an AA program, and he took me and got me help that I needed, that I didn't even know. I had no idea that he was. There was so much stigma around mental health at that point that, we'd have never had these conversations. And so I adjusted my career path after that into psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner instead of anesthesia. So I gave up on the anesthesia dream and went into psych nurse practitioner. And that was my goal, was because I saw through a lot of this treatments and therapy and things I were doing, I was just in the back of my head going, man, if I'd had this 10 years ago, I'd have never gotten here. If someone would have told me this 10 years ago, my family would still be here and all that. And it ended up getting my family back. I always forget to say that. But we worked things out, but that was through all of my treatment and everything. What I'm doing now, is I kind of completely devoted the rest of my career and probably my life to just that, is one, breaking down the stigma of mental health, that it is okay to talk about it. It's completely acceptable to sit here and have conversations like we're having right now. Those were things that I certainly never would have done. We wouldn't have talked about these things. I'd have struggled until the very end. And just like David said, there wouldn't have been any signs or anything like that. As far as everybody at work knew, I was doing great. It was those that were closest to me that would have seen it, but they didn't want to bring it up either, because, if you're the breadwinner, you're the one who brings home the money, and you're the one that's successful in the family, you don't want to alter that career. You worry about that, right? And so no one would bring it up. So that's what we're doing now, is I'm working on breaking down that stigma. And I was interested to hear what David said, because it's kind of exactly what we're doing. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. What I'm doing is, all of the prevention programs, everything we call prevention, was reaction. Nothing's prevention. If I go through a door and I'm coming for help, that's reaction. Primary prevention, by definition, is a flu shot. Way before you get the flu, let's give you a shot and make the symptoms less, or possibly avoid you having it altogether. But we're not doing prevention. We're doing if you have these things, here's the signs, this is how we react. We're providing resources for service members to go to when they're struggling, which, when you really sit back and think about it, how realistic is that many of them are going to go seek out, like, we can't expect them to seek out resources when they're not regulated themselves. They're not making regulated decisions. They're not in a process in their brain to make regulated decisions, but we're expecting them to do that. And then you couple it with alcohol, like most of them do, and you just have a completely dysregulated individual who's making irrational decisions, but we're expecting him to call some hotline or go to a resource that he probably doesn't believe in anyway, he or she. And so what we're
Mm.
doing now is we have this course called Trauma Informed Leadership. I was super fortunate when I went through my own treatment and I signed up for therapy for the first time, which, mind you, this is 15 years into the military, the entire GWAT, and I never once talked about how anything affected me, just like most. And I went through treatment, and when you sign up for treatment, for therapy, sorry, not treatment. When you sign up for therapy, you had to go through a three-part process of classes. It was trauma-informed leadership, cognitive behavioral therapy, and then an inner critic workshop. And those are all three workshops, and you get them on Fridays, and they answer a lot of your questions when you're going through them. Well, when I got trauma-informed leadership, and it was taught by our social worker on Quantico, Rebecca Cunningham, who has just done amazing, wonderful things. You should get her on your show, Brett. She she was teaching trauma informed leadership, and at the end I walked up to her and I was like, Rebecca, again, like I said, if I had this 10 years ago, like I never would have had a drinking problem. I would have understood that it would have been a completely different outcome. Me and my family wouldn't have all of these issues. And she said, let me show you the feedback. So she shows me the feedback, 100% positive feedback over 3 years. That's E1 to O6. And they all said the
Wow.
same thing. Man, if I'd have had this 10 years ago, I'd still be married. If my buddy would have had this, he wouldn't have committed suicide. And it was just, pages and pages and pages of feedback like this. So I said, hey, what can I do to help facilitate this to the entirety of the Marine Corps or DOD? And she said, that's exactly what we want to do. And at that point in time, in order to get that class, you had to come in clinically. So you can imagine the small percentage of individuals we were capturing because the stigma still exists around mental health. So we were capturing basically no one. The people that their command made them come, and then those who were honest with themselves that they were struggling. But everyone else, we weren't capturing the ones we needed. And so she tailored the course, and we've been on a road show for about 2 years now, maybe a little bit more. And we've been taking this course to headquarters Marine Corps. We're in the POI at TBS. So all of the brand new lieutenants are getting this class now. We're in EWS, the Expeditionary Warfare School. So all of your future company commanders and your O3 level officers are getting this. And with them, we all do separate case studies with them. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go, but kind of what we're doing with that is providing these tools up front. And we're providing it under the umbrella of this is a leadership thing. This is for you to provide your Marine. This isn't for you. But then towards the end of the class, it clicks in and they're like, this was definitely for me. And so like I yell at my kids a lot. So, that's one of the biggest things I'm doing right now. The other is the farm concept. Can't talk too much on it right now because it's under contract and all that. We're hoping to make it happen. But the idea behind the farm, we spoke to it on my last podcast. And I hope that within the next 3 months, it's going to be just blossoming into something amazing. But what we're doing is we've looked at all of these nonprofits and these veteran organizations that have recognized there's a problem. Like when guys get out or guys get back from deployment and the unit separates and they lose those support systems and how quickly they fall off and how, they don't have tools they need and they don't have support systems. They don't have healthy coping mechanisms or healthy habits. And so you have all of these nonprofits like Healing Waters, Combat Marine Outdoors. There's a ton of them that have owned this problem, but the Marine Corps and DOD, they recognize there's an issue, but they've never said, let's do anything about it. So at the farm, what we're trying to do is not a rehab, but more of a respite. We're calling it an experiential learning system where you come out here for 5 to 10 days and we teach you all of the mechanisms. We're going to teach you how to take care of large animals, equine therapy, yoga, archery, gardening, all of these things that you can take back to your unit, your home, and replicate. And these are healthy habits that you'll now have. Once you come to the farm, your alumni, you can always come back. And so we're doing that. And then lastly, the last thing I did was we created Operation Resiliency,
That's
which
awesome.
was a dream last time we talked, but that is now there where I had saw your email earlier. And we were talking about how patients have to get through so many providers to seek care, and that's exactly why we created Operation Resiliency. Was I brought everyone into one healthcare system. So I have PAs, NPs for primary care and longevity care. We have sports medicine providers for injuries, and the reason for that, a lot of people raise their eyebrows when I say that, but the reason for that is I can't tell you how many times I sit in a therapy session or a psych session and somebody's like, everything was good until this injury. And so we say, well, great. Well, we'll work with you there, but let's focus on the injury then. And so, we have therapy, we have psych nurse practitioners for med management, and we've kind of encapsulated all collaborative providers into one, outside of like extreme specialists. Like I don't have a GI doc or a cardiologist. I wish. We can't afford that, right? Bringing all of them into one unit where we can collaborate across all specialties to try to take a holistic approach for patient care. But in a nutshell, that's what I've been up to in the past year.
Those are amazing, both of those things, your work, David, and yours, Mike. I'm noticing a couple of similarities here. One, that you both have experienced it in the trenches. You've experienced your own struggles with mental health and where that led you, and that pushed you towards these career paths. And then you're both approaching it from different angles, but there's a very similar kind of bent to it where David, where you're talking about life preservation, and per our previous conversations, I know you're doing a lot through community development and community awareness and that sort of thing. And then Mike, through bringing all these resources together, building these resources and breaking down the stigma and barriers to the early prevention. And I see a couple things here where you both seem to kind of agree that the individual is not going to be obvious. The individual who's struggling is not going to be obvious, and probably not going to be the one that raises their hand for help, even though for those that do, that's amazing. And we want to make a way for those. But then I see that there's a focus on how do we build a better community culture and like leadership climate so that we can do more prevention, more life preservation, rather than just trying to react, as Mike said earlier. And so I'd like to dig into a little bit more of that right now. How would you describe the current climate of military mental health today? And I know it sounds like there's a lot of people trying to do good things. There's a lot of people who are doing good things. And then there's probably some gaps. Like let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And how do you currently assess military mental health in the U.S. today? David, would you like to start?
So I didn't share. I had the incredible opportunity on 9 December to go and brief the Army G1. So that's Lieutenant General Brian Eifler, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. And then while I was there, I also briefed the head at the SES and all the senior, both green suiters and not, who were the Army's Directorate for Prevention, Resilience, and Readiness. And, General Eifler and I have known each other for 4 years and have worked together when he was the CG at the 11th Airborne, and then he got promoted there. But so I knew he's very open to this whole concept of life preservation. His belief, he shares mine, that connection, which is this experience right here, creates hope, and hope saves lives. But I'll be honest, I was a little, actually more than a little nervous. I knew I was going to meet this group of extraordinary people who are the DPRR, and staff sent me their bios. Yeah, so it's the Army's Directorate of Prevention, Resiliency, and Readiness. So this is where in the Army, this is where all of these programs come under. And these are, so at the SES level, these are like civilian 2-star, and their 06 level, very impressive group of people. And they sent me their resumes. I was like, wow, or their bios. And then I thought, okay, well, this is, going to be like kind of a kumbaya sort of meeting. And then the night before I went to the Pentagon, they said, well, hey, Mr. Bartley, here's the read ahead for the meeting tomorrow. And I'm like, read ahead? Like, what do you mean? And it was this slide deck, which basically, and I had read up on the program and I had heard of them, but I thought, man, I'm going to walk in there and they're going to say, look, that's BS, is preservation. That's cute and cuddly. You have no idea what you're talking about. Prevention is the way. And I walked in, it was totally different. They were like, oh my God, we've heard all about you and we're really excited and we want to hear your ideas. And here you sit at the head of the table, and like, what are you talking about? So all this to say, And this was also my experience in this most recent, 40 talks in 2 weeks. And I heard it, and I don't take credit for it, just as I know my brother would say the same thing. Mike would say the same thing, that he looks as himself as a messenger, as this conduit through which changes that are needed come through. And I heard this all the way from the 2-star level to the E1 level, where people come up and say, wow, and I'm going to borrow what Mike talked about. It's like, this is exactly what the Army needs, with all this other stuff. It worked to a certain degree. We've got to shift into a different direction because we're not having any success. I mean, the numbers are not changing. And the change, especially when you look at, what Mike's doing at a whole level of expertise that I'm not at, to take maybe some of the concepts that I have, and we can drill them down a little bit more in terms of, I give people actionable TTPs. But all this to say, brother, in answer to your question, at least from the Army perspective, the Army's very open. They're incredibly open to this change. And they feel like, based on the feedback that I've gotten, it's not just a refreshing change in nomenclature, like, oh yeah, life preservation. No, because these other things, they don't work. And yet we keep teaching them that this is the way. And I think, actually, I wrote down, and it was really something Mike just said, that, and I think it would be for a Marine as well as a soldier, like, I think that they've gotten to the place where the individual service member, they don't even believe in prevention. Like, it's not that it's just like, yeah, I keep hearing the same message. Like, they don't even believe in it anymore. And Mike brought up a perfect point, that if in fact, let's say you teach the signs, well, if I see the signs, what am I doing? And Mike said it, I'm reacting. That's not upstream, it's downstream. And the other thing, and I'll end with this and shift it to Mike. And I read about this, and at first it took me a little while to put it in my mind, but it's brilliant. Somebody talks about the difference between a deficit mindset and an asset-based mindset. Prevention is really a deficit-based mindset, in that it's based on trying to fix something that's broken, which is really what the whole prevention model is doing, as opposed to an asset-based mindset, which is exactly everything that Mike is doing. It's an asset-based mindset. You're not broken, you're injured. What you require is healing, as opposed to being fixed. And, those slight variations in the way that we talk about something is incredibly important. Language, we all know what the power of language is. So I guess the most important takeaway in this part for me, brother, is that the Army, I've been surprised, at very up to the 3-star level, is very open to at least considering and hearing new ideas.
Hi, there's something you may not know about this podcast. It isn't just a podcast. It's a coordination effort disguised as a podcast. Chronic and complex illness is rising in the United States. According to the CDC, over 75% of adults live with at least one chronic condition, and many spend years, sometimes decades, trying to find real answers. This isn't the fault of the individual healthcare providers. Most are skilled, well-intentioned professionals working inside a fragmented system that limits collaboration. If you or someone you love has faced chronic illness, you know how difficult it is to navigate this system. This podcast exists to help promote a more collaborative environment and ecosystem for healthcare. Our goal is to make the U.S. healthcare system work better for patients and providers alike. If you believe in this mission, you could help us immensely by liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode with someone who could benefit from it. That simple action helps build momentum towards a more connected and effective healthcare system. Thank you. So I'm seeing a couple things there. One, that it sounds like the leadership in the Army, at least, is they see that there's a problem. They have a lot of things that they're trying to do. They see that there's a problem. They're trying to fix it. They're working hard. They're doing all these different things, but they also see this isn't working and we need something new. Right now, we're just doing what we know, but it's not having the results that we're looking for. And it sounds like you seem to have experienced that for all the different people who've like come up to you after different talks and stuff like that and had that experience. But it sounds like there's definitely a gap between what we're trying to do and what the actual culture is kind of propagating versus what's actually being taught versus what the soldiers are actually experiencing, the enlisted and officers and all that are experiencing. And something needs to shift. Many people are trying to do very good things and many people are doing very good things, but Still there's more that needs to happen.
Yep.
Mike, what's your take?
Yeah, no, I agree. So I speak more. I'm meeting with DoD this week or next week, so I should be more well versed on Army things. But I speak intelligently on Marine Corps, Navy specifically right now, and I mean I'll start off by saying I have been shocked with the response of the '05, '06, and general level when it comes to these programs. Like every time that I give a talk or a class or a pitch on a program, I'm just expecting to get shooed away. Like David said, this is fluffy nonsense. I don't want to talk about it. And something over the past 12 months has happened where we're being brought in. We're being requested to come in. We're being told that this is priority. We're, being offered funding for things that in the past I would have considered. They would have looked at it as, not something we need to have a primary focus on. And so there is a shift going on right now. While the stigma is certainly still there, especially at the lower levels, surprisingly, I think that those individuals that went through GWAT and have watched these numbers rise and rise and rise have certainly accepted that this is a losing battle, and we do need to prioritize it. There is that. Now, as far as the programs and what we're doing, again, we are prioritizing it. We really are. Like the meetings that I sit in and the things that I hear, we're prioritizing. Are we prioritizing the right programs? And are the programs that we're prioritizing 100% inclusive of what we need? No, I don't think so. But the fact of the matter is like a lot of the programs that we've been using for so long are outdated. Like let's say the Oscar program right now is one that the Marine Corps uses. It's operational stress control, and I should know what the R is. I don't know, maybe cut that out. So with Oscar, they focuses on capturing exactly what we're saying. So yes, it is a prevention in the sense of like I'm educating individuals what it looks like, but I'm also reliant on the individual expressing these signs and symptoms. Whereas, we've kind of updated a lot of it to educate them on more of, okay, I'm not necessarily looking at signs and symptoms of the individual. I'm looking at more of life stressors. Like when he says that him and his wife got in an argument, when I find out that he's struggling a little bit financially, when I know that he got back from a deployment and was denied leave, like these things right here are becoming red flags that we can identify early on, as opposed to I'm reliant on this individual coming to me and telling me how he's feeling or selling all of his prized possessions before he has an attempt, which is what we had educated on for so long. Like you're looking for that very obvious sign of, oh man, this guy quit showing up to work, doesn't shave anymore, his uniform's unkempt, and he's selling his Xbox, and that's the only thing he owns in his barracks room. Yeah, that's some obvious red flags. But now we're looking at more of the subtle red flags with a lot of the programs that are out there. The problem being a lot of these programs that we push are very singular focused. So it's like singularly on one identifiable mechanism of suicide prevention or heavily focused on drinking or heavily focused on relationships, but looking at the big picture of how do I step back and educate fully where individuals can fully comprehend the effects that combat or just military, because a lot of times we focus on combat a lot, and a lot of our prevention programs are built around combat. But the reality is like the majority of people that serve in the military do not experience combat, but also the majority of the people that serve in the military do experience trauma. And so trying to take that and reorient the terms on, hey, this doesn't need to be a combat focus. It just needs to be a trauma focus. All inclusive when you say trauma, less inclusive when you say combat, and focus on that. So that's kind of one of the biggest pushes that we're having right
And
now
there's
is how to
it's a really
focus.
important
Yeah,
it's a
how to
really
focus
important point
more
there,
on.
especially as with technology is allowing for a more kind of global war. I know, for example, it's a very easy example of drone operators. They never technically deployed in a lot of cases, that people who are like UAV operators, drone operators, but they are right there in it, and they're actually seen. And there's been a recent push in the last few years, from what I've understood, to kind of include or to build awareness a little bit more of that situation is people who still go home and kiss their wife and their kids, but then they go to work and they're driving a drone and firing weapons and all that stuff just from a computer. But then there's also the aspect of, my wife and I have talked a lot about how a lot of current military culture is kind of built around a deployed mindset, even though most of them spend most of their time in garrison. So there's still a lot of the mindset of suck it up and go. We got to push. We got to get the next thing. We got to always running, always doing the next thing, and never showing any weakness. And there's a place for that in some ways in the deployment. But then we've kind of taken that same mindset and kept it when we came back home and are in garrison or whatever. And there's still a lot of the same issues. So I'm glad that you guys are working to kind of build that awareness a lot more.
Now, it's interesting to one of the things in the kind of the middle of my basic brief that I have now is to deepen understanding, be it, because you figured, be it a battalion or a squad, whoever number of people that I'm talking to, and Mike had alluded to this, that what I'm going to share is either they're going to personally relate as they're struggling with it themselves, or ideally they're going to be able to respond to somebody who is. And the first thing that I talk about in that regard to give somebody an idea of what it's like is, oftentimes we'll use a definition because you really can't argue with the dictionary. Okay, this definition comes from the Cambridge Dictionary. And the first thing I talk about is trauma. So I say, when somebody comes to you, you've created the space where they feel safe to share something, and they say, "Hey, I'm feeling traumatized," and you're like, "Wow, I'm so sorry. What would you like to share about that?" And I say, people, you don't want to ask them that. Do they want to tell about that or talk about it? You want to share. So you want to share about that, and they do, and they share the experience. And maybe because we're all human beings, you think, God, that's really not that traumatic. Like, really? Well, one, don't say that. And realize the definition of trauma from the Cambridge Dictionary is severe and lasting emotional shock and pain caused by an extremely upsetting experience. That's it. So, and on the slide deck that I'll use on that, I underscored those last three words. I said, you know what that means? It can be anything. It can be literally anything. So you could be a drone operator. You could be in force recon. You could have a brother who's gone downrange for an extended period of time. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But if you understand, if you truly want to help mitigate without needing a degree or anything else, to create the space where somebody feels connected and they feel seen, heard, and valued, then what I've shared with people is, so they share, and then the first thing that you say, ideally, when they've shared something that is traumatic to them, and again, all it needs to be is an extremely upsetting experience, not suck it up, buttercup, and you literally say, "Thank you for sharing." And that'll shock people because they're like, "Wait, you didn't try to talk me out of my feelings? Or you didn't tell me that, hey, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger?" Or any other BS that we hear. You actually thanked me for sharing, which is what the police officer did on the bridge when I'm about to kill myself. And then what I think, I truly believe that this question will save more people than anything in the world, is when he asked me, and this is what I had shared 100 times easy in Korea, is he said, "What can I do to help you feel supported right now?" And what he didn't say was, hey man, what can I do for you right now? Because what would we have said? What would I have said? Nothing at all. That question has an accessibility that is so freaking brilliant that people, and what I tell soldiers, and like Mike said, all the way at the 09 level to the E1 level, when you create the space where somebody feels safe to share something traumatic, you don't try to talk them out of how they feel. You listened, and then you thank them for sharing, and then you say, "Hey man, what can I do to help you feel supported right now?" 99% of the time, you know what they're going to say? You already have, because nobody does that. So that's my take on the trauma part.
So David, I'd like to zoom in, or maybe even zoom out a little bit more. We've talked a lot about kind of the issues the difficulties of addressing people who are facing these issues, and how to finding them and helping them. And we've talked a lot about the issues, and then we've alluded a little bit, and just recently you zeroed in a little bit more on how do you actually begin to approach that. But I want to focus on your kind of community approach that you've been working on, and just kind of understand, like, what from say from the perspective of a commander, from the perspective of someone who's kind of in charge of the community, in charge of the culture, all that, what is the role of community in life preservation? Like, what does it get the rubber on the road? What does it actually mean for someone who's trying to orchestrate that kind of community?
No, I can tell you, and you know who I learned it from was my brother. This is what he was. And Mike, you would, even though he was Army, you would have loved working for him because this is what he taught me. In answer to your question, he had taught me, I'll never forget when he said this, Brad. He said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I think a lot of commanders, and I've spent enough time, even though I've not been in uniform, but I've spent enough time on the Army, that there are commanders who come in, you know, having graduated from West Point or gone green to gold or whatever it is, even on the, not even on the enlisted or the officer side. Okay, you know, this is what we got to do. Here's the mission. Here's everything. This is the SOP, all this other stuff. And they're so driven by the desire to be successful, which is totally understandable, that they miss the opportunity and they miss the necessity. It all boils down to connection. And it's not a cute and cuddly term. And if you don't have it, you are not going to have an effective squad or company or battalion, or just go all the way up. And so I always go back. So at the foundation, you know, because I'll talk about connection, but okay, what is it? Because I don't want to be the type of speaker who just throws out a term and never anchors it down. And so I use the Brene Brown, it's her quote, it should be in the dictionary, in which she says, I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, when they feel heard, and when they feel valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and they derive strength and sustenance from the relationship. So we all know, Mike and the Marines, my experience of being in my family and being around the Army primarily, Brett, you and your experience, we all know what that feels like when you feel seen, heard, and valued. I mean, that changes everything. And the thing that I introduced to the Army recently, and I don't think we talked about it on the podcast, and it dawned on me. Because you think, okay, well, what is it ultimately that drives a person to suicide? And I had an epiphany. And what I came to realize, and then realize that this is actually science, is I wasn't going to kill myself because of what I was thinking and feeling. Ultimately, I was going to kill myself because of what I believed. And I really delved into this more and more and more. And so every action that we see is driven by a belief that we don't. In other words, so we have a belief set. Our beliefs dictate the paradigm from which we think. You can't outthink your belief. And I'm speaking secular. I'm not speaking spiritual at this point. So you have your beliefs that dictates the paradigm from which you think, because it's like if Mike gets PCS'd to Germany and is frustrated that he can't speak German, I'd say, brother, did you take a class on German? He'd say, no, I didn't. Well, how would you expect to speak German? It'd be the same thing for me. So in other words, if you want to think different, you change your belief. So you expand your beliefs.
But it sounds like this is very much on the individual level. But how do we set up a community to shift that?
It is, because you have to understand, and bear with me 2 seconds. I promise I'm getting there. So beliefs initiate thought. Thought initiates feeling, and feeling drives action. That's science. So then you become, okay, well, how do beliefs come about? There's only one way. All beliefs come by way of experience. Everything in life is an experience. This is an experience right now. When you go to Starbucks, it's experience. If we have an intimate with our partner, if you get in a car accident, everything is an experience. An experience impacts belief one of 3 ways. Either it creates a brand new belief. We've all had that. Or it supports your dominant belief, or it begins to diminish a belief that you don't want. My brother's experience going to God knows how many 12-step meetings that Mike has gone to changed his belief structure. So to go back, so what we can do at the individual, but to your point, to your question, at a command level, if you want to create a culture shift in your command, then you need to be focused on creating connection, because every aspect of connection is what? It's an experience. Every experience is going to impact how somebody believes and what they think, feel, and do. So it's at the command level. So the TTPs that I teach are all about creating connection. So if I look at what my brother did in 42 and a half years, I mean, he's not an easy guy, but he was fair and loyal and everything else. So he I don't have the slide here with me. What he did was he said, David, back in the day, you kept a book on everybody. Mike probably did it automatically. And so over time, you collected aspects of the individuals that you were leading so that you could do what? So you could have a deeper connection with each of them. And so if you have these, then the more connected you become with your individuals, that expands into what is the culture for the command. As the culture, then the individuals believe differently, and then there's a different culture in the command, things change because the foundation then is hope, not hope cute cuddly, like hope. No, I can count on this. I want a bit of a soapbox.
So let me get this straight. The main way, or I should say the most effective way that you're saying that a commander can essentially set up this community intervention or community prevention is basically to set up regular experiences that build connection or that build a type of connection that's in alignment with with the type of change they're trying to enact in their culture. I mean, one of the ways it's coming to me right now, you can kind of think of a person kind of develops their psyche through experiences, and an organization develops their culture through experiences. And so as someone who's in charge of that organization, you should set up regular experiences where you are essentially cultivating the culture of your organization through intentional experiences. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Because each one of those experiences is going to impact a person's belief. And so the other thing at the end of my brief, I say, there may be people who hear, because I teach people, it's incredibly simple. I said, look, become great with people's names. Like how many people would say, oh yeah, I'm really good with people's names. And I'm not talking about the last name on the uniform. I'm talking about the name that precedes that. And then, do you know their spouse's names? Do you know their kids' names? Do you know their dogs' names? Like I tell people, if you want to be below the zone on your promotion, get good at that. Like it is, I mean, people are so they're dying literally for recognition. It is astonishing to me how simple it is. And so, and then there's other parts too, but
So Mike,
and then I just had one point. So people may say, well, yeah, does it really make a difference? And I'll jump between a story. I'll have some scientific proof and some other things. But ultimately, for the people who like me, and maybe even like Mike, if I may, brother, who are we're teetering on hopelessness, those aspects of connection can be a tipping point. Or then maybe like, and brother, correct me if I'm wrong, something changed on the day that you finally picked up and made that call to your friend. I don't know what it was, but to me, if I had to say there was some tipping point. And so for me, connection, especially done consistently and repeatedly and on point, can have a tipping point where, because I'm leaving the clinical stuff to Mike. I'm not clinical. That's not my forte. But I'm saying the tipping point, because you feel connected, it could be, you know what, maybe I'll give counseling a try, or maybe I'll go see the chaplain, or in the Army and MFLAC, or you know what, maybe I will give meds a try. So ultimately, that's what I think a command can do to change things dramatically.
and Mike, what about the role of like clinical and systemic changes, a lot of these supporting elements and kind of, I would dare say, infrastructural elements that you're working on? Where does this actually come into shifting the current norm? Where does it actually, the rubber meet the road, and how that actually, the gears that turn to actually shift the culture in the military?
Yeah. So
Regarding this.
it sounds like what you're speaking to, David, is more of the like intrusive leadership and servant leadership styles, which are absolutely necessary within this realm. The issue that we've kind of seen with it is you have this intrusive leadership style of like, I want to know everything about you and I want to do everything, but junior folks see right through it, as far as like, use this term lightly, but like hypocritical, right? So if I'm saying, hey, how are you? How's everything going? Have you talked to the MFLAC? Have you gone and got counseling? Have you done all that? But like, I know you're dealing with it too, and you haven't done it. I'm not going to do it because you didn't do it, right? Talking about you as the leader. And so I think one of the biggest things that we've seen having success and shifting the culture, like I spoke to a second ago, is watching the leaders really step up and become that example. We had one '06 colonel on Quantico who went to every single counseling, therapy, anything that there was that he could enroll himself, any resource that we had for financial, marriage, all the things. And he would go and he enrolled himself and he wanted to become familiar with the program, but he wanted all the Marines on base to see that it's okay that he go there. And that's okay. And then he would spend his lunch break hanging out in the waiting room of the behavioral health clinic. He didn't even have an appointment. He would just hang out in the behavioral health clinic to show that, hey, if I'm here, then you can be here. If it's okay for me to be here, then it's okay for you to be here. And that's one of the biggest steps that we've made in the right direction. However, all of that to say, if we don't have the cultural shift correctly aligned with that, it's never going to work. We're still looking at prevention. We're still looking at individuals. We're still depending on those individual leaders to make these changes where kind of the different approach that I'm taking, where the rubber hits the road for me, is let's dive into the early on, lieutenants, the PFCs, the privates, and let's start talking about culture. And what you'll find is I have no problem getting a speaker to come in that is a 506, a GWAT veteran, and saying, yep, I dealt with this in my command. We never addressed it, and here I am today. And one of the biggest things that we teach is how we approach particular events. So one thing that we discuss is how trauma affects everyone differently. Me and you can see the exact same traumatic situation. It may have zero lasting effects on me, and it may have life debilitating effects on you. And we're all going to perceive it different. What we found over time is a lot of that relates to your adverse childhood events, which is a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente that was actually trying to figure out why people who lose a bunch of weight gain it back so quickly and all of a sudden fall off. And they dove in, and there was no demographic or any other relation other than what they found was adverse childhood events. And it was trauma that they experienced, whether that was not having enough food in the house, or sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. All of there's 10 categories of an ACE score. And so if we educate our leaders, our young leaders, on understanding that everyone's trauma is different, everyone has had a different percentage of trauma in their life, we educate them on what adverse childhood events, and guess what? The adverse childhood events in the military are significantly higher. And that's because a lot of people join the military to get away from whatever was creating that adverse childhood event. So now you, as a 19, 20, 21-year-old leader, are expected to lead these people the exact same as someone who didn't experience any adverse childhood events. So kind of educating on that front is where the rubber meets the road on, let's just flood them with education and then try to shift the culture. And one of the biggest things that I do to shift culture, and it is, back to the fluffy talk, like people worry, especially in the Marine Corps, it's like, we're not going to, the Marine Corps is still going to be hard. Yeah, everything that I'm teaching is a readiness and a redeployability thing. Like, I want your Marines to be alive for the next deployment. I want your Marines to be mentally stable enough to deploy again. So this is no fluffy, softening stuff. But what we look at is a lot of times in the military, we jump straight to correcting the problem. Just like a husband and a wife. When a wife comes and has a problem and the husband interrupts and goes, I got the solution. And he interrupts and he doesn't even listen what the problem was. And he has the solution and he interjects and he just jumps right in. When really all she wanted to do was be heard, right? And so many husbands, including myself, I'm the number one of all husbands that love to do that, fail at the opportunity of just providing support for their spouse who just needed to be heard. So if we replicate that and we take that into leadership and we look at the culture of, if we're spending all of our time jumping to truth, well, are we building any trust? David had spoke earlier to connection, so take that a little bit further and look at connection in the terms of trust. If I'm a leader, my Marine, my soldier, my sailor, they need to trust me. And so let's say, for instance, I have somebody that gets a DUI. I get the call on a Saturday night that I need to go pick them up from the drunk tank. Well, when I go to pick them up, how I respond in that initial second is that's the culture. That I am a representative of the command. I'm a representative of the organization, the uniform, everything. When I get there and I say, get in the car, you dumbass, that's the organization saying that. That's not me. That's not Mike Murphy. That's the organization. But when I say, hey, this is so unlike you, man. What happened? How did we get here? What can I do? What could I have done? Make this we statements. Talk about us. And so what we teach is it's called the SET technique, and it's support, empathy, and truth. And where as many times as leader, we jump straight to truth, and I jump in and I say, you're an idiot, your career's over, let's get back to the barracks. And then I drop him off at the barracks and just, cross my fingers that he's not going to die by suicide tonight. Whereas now, I don't need to get to truth before I get to support and empathy, because I want him to know that I am here for him. And so I want to provide support. I want to say, hey, do you want to go grab something to eat and let's talk about this? Let's find out what happened. Because if you got a DUI, that's a high risk taking behavior. So if you put those terms around it, now he's taking high risk taking behaviors. Well, what leads to that? It's usually relationship problems, alcohol, PTSD, some traumatic situation that led to a high risk taking behavior. But we look at the DUI and we just jump right to punishment. But now I'm taking a more supportive approach, and then I'm making empathetic comments, right? I don't want to say, as someone who has never dealt with a DUI while in uniform, hey, I understand what you're going through, because I don't. And again, he's going to look right through me and see right through and know that, no, you don't understand this. But I certainly can say that I understand that what you're dealing with is having a major effect on you. And I want you to know that whatever we're dealing with, we're in it together. Like I'm going to be here with you every step of the way. And I'm providing that support. So S&E, the support and the empathy, are for one reason. I want to know that when I drop him off at the barracks or at his home or wherever that night, that I'm comfortable with leaving him there and knowing that he's going to call me if he needs anything. We don't even need to get the truth. Not that night. There's no reason to get to that at all, especially if I don't have NJP capability or authority. There's no reason for me to even get to truth. I just need to build trust and support. And ideally, that's done way before this DUI happens. But the cultural shift needs to be how we approach situations, how we represent the organization, and how we make these individuals feel. Because at the end of the day, their families are entrusting us as leaders on looking out for them while they just sent their 18, 19-year-old off and entrusted them into our care. Providing that support, providing that empathy, and then discussing truth. But when you discuss truth and you say, hey, look, you got a DUI, you're going to get in trouble, there's probably an NJP coming, and then immediately circle back to support. But look, whatever happens, we're going to get through it. We're going to do it together. I'm going to push for everything that I can to help you out, and we're gonna get through this entire situation together. And so I think taking approaches like that are going to be the biggest step in the right direction for breaking down the stigma, because now there's a more supportive approach and trust building, rather than like, you're not making the cut, you're out, get out of my way. Like, the machine, the organization is just going to run past you, and we're leaving too many brothers and sisters on the side without any of that support.
There's something that's really big that comes into that as well, that I think some of our civilian viewers might not quite have experienced before, is just essentially the power dynamic that people in the military experience. It's one thing when you are in a civilian corporation. Yes, you can get fired. Yes, you can lose your job if you don't toe the line, all this stuff. But I think it's really hard, perhaps, for most civilians to comprehend. When you enter the military, they own you. Everything about you, they own you. And it's really hard to be, especially I was enlisted, to be a young enlisted person in that situation. And you're being told from the podium, like, you should speak up if you have mental health, or if you're struggling, or if you need help, or whatever. But then you also have this dynamic of, if you and your supervisor are having a problem, they're probably going to believe your supervisor. And there's a dynamic that builds there. And so I love what you're saying there, Mike, where taking the time in the individual moments to build trust, not just on an individual level, but especially as someone who represents the organization. Really, the higher up you are in the hierarchy, the more you represent the organization. And really becoming aware of that and making sure that it's those little moments. And I love the story that you shared of your prior I think it was a post commander or something that went and basically made sure that he frequented all of the different services. I think that's an amazing work to try to shift the culture, knowing his position as a commander, knowing that he represents the organization, and then. So given that this is a massive organization, given that this is steeped in tradition and culture, and basically everything moves extremely slowly when you're looking at systems-wide change and cultural change, what do you think, and I'm talking to both of you right now, what do you think can be realistically changed in the next few years? Like what type of system-wide change can actually happen given the constraints that we have of culture and funding and all that stuff? Like, what can we actually look for in the next few years?
So one, I want to speak to, you had talked about some of the culture and some of the shifts. One thing that you had spoke to the military kind of owns you, right? And I don't know the research on this, but in my own practice and what I see with my own experience is, in fact, the majority of individuals who consider or have attempted suicide, and again, this is in my own experience, my own practice, is due to nonconformity, meaning they're just struggling with conforming. This is an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old that is conforming with this newfound, like, strict guidelines, strict uniform, can't take off when you want to get off, don't have control of your life, your liberty, any of those things. And they struggle with that. And then you remove them from their social structure, or the small social structure they may have had, depending on what their background was from what they come from. And now they just feel completely hopeless and lost, and they regret the decisions they make. And the only thing, they make these a permanent solution for a temporary problem, right? What I teach, and one of the funny things, before we jump into what you just asked, well, one thing I say to non-conformity, I've spent 20 years in the military and I wear blue socks. That is my, I feel like a human every morning for 20 years. I have worn blue socks. And it's funny, little things like that.
For those viewers who might not know, every piece of clothing that you wear has regulation on it, and everything that you are told down to the which item of clothing, except for maybe underwear. I've never been told what kind of underwear I can wear, but pretty much everything else you're told what you can wear. And so this is funny. Your little sense of self-expression.
Yeah. And that's my, and that's what I tell them. And I'll joke and, pull up my pants and show them, like, hey, this is my little bit of, like, human sticking it back, my little non-conformity, because I get it. You want to be able to express yourself or be yourself. And, everyone wants to do that in individual ways, but mine was always blue socks. And somebody gave me an idea a long time ago. I don't think on purpose. I think they just said, "Why don't you try this?" And I did, and I felt great. So we give ideas like that. As far as what we have to look forward to and what's coming, I think we're over the hump of the stigma. I think that's the best thing. I think we're getting over the hump. A lot of leaders at all levels are accepting that this is a problem, which is what you need to make change, right? And they are. They're identifying this is a real problem. Sure, the suicide rates show it, but that's not the full picture. The full picture is deployability, like not just suicide, but if they have a mental health disorder, if they're struggling elsewhere, they may not be deployable right now. So how much is that taking away from the battalion or the company or the platoon? What else is struggling? What is this person's depression, anxiety creating within the platoon, within the formation? And so I think a lot of leaders are recognizing the fact that this is in fact a problem that needs to be solved. And I think what we have to look forward to is the fact that they're willing to take on what it is to do that. They're willing to kind of swallow some of the stigma that's been around forever and say, hey, maybe it is okay. I spoke at an event, I don't know, 6 months ago now, and Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, Sergeant Major Ruiz, steps out after me. And he said a lot of things, but one of the most important things that I think he said was, I want Marines to take their mental health as serious as they do their physical health. And if you know how serious Marines take their physical health, that's a huge statement right there. I mean, these are guys that are in the gym all the time. And he's saying, hey, it's just as important to focus on your mental health. Well, we've never done that. We've never needed to do that, you know? In fact, in order to deal with my mental health, I just go back to the gym and I power through a workout, you know? And now you're telling me it's okay to go talk about it. And so I think that's what we have to look forward to. But I think there's certainly still a ton of red tape, and there's issues at all levels of how to get the right thing across. Again, there's no one-all fix. So if we say, hey, we're going to prioritize this, and then we just throw a random program at it that focuses on one secular event, it may not be the right thing for what we need. What do you think, David?
I agree with you 100%. And so that, just as a clarification on something I had said earlier, and I didn't do a very good job explaining it, is I agree with you. The TTPs that I teach, those standard questions about, hey, are you thinking about killing yourself? And those other things, I divert completely away from there. And it would dovetail into what you were saying, that the Marine Corps and I think the Army and then the other great services, if we teach young leaders how best, well, two things, the impact of trauma. I don't know what the percentages are of how many human beings on the planet, regardless of age, have had what would be considered to be a traumatic event that would score high on ACE. It's got to be ridiculous. It's got to be off the chart. Yeah, thank you, brother.
I'm guessing far more than people think.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, it's
93 almost in the service.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to use those numbers. So if we can educate people to, what I would take what you had said from in your clinical brilliance and in my what I am now, you could really say preaching. And actually I read a report is that trauma is the primary creator of belief. So those events that the great young men and women are coming into the service. So that trauma. So I was tortured. I was raped and sodomized when I was 12 by a Boy Scout leader. And that was in the early 70s. And this POS would literally say to me every time, hey, don't worry. These are all initiations and all the boys go through it, but we don't talk about it. And in that day and age, you didn't talk about it. And so that's the experience, creates this belief set and everything else that happened as a result. And what has changed as a result, because I talk about this early in the brief and then later say, I'm not the same person because like you, brother, done all this work that has changed. I don't believe the same thing I believed 15 years ago when I was going to kill myself. So I think, now let me check that. I believe that the military, what we have to look forward to, what Mike said, it's going to take time, but I really think that we're over the hump. That things, and I don't know what, be it 5 years, I would have to think, if we looked ahead 10 years, things are going to be drastically different. That Marines, the Marines will, per what the Sergeant Major in the Marine Corps said, mental health is just as important as my physical health. And in the Army, the same sort of thing. And I think it's just given what, the people who are calling Mike and the people who are calling me to say, we'd like to look at different possibilities. Whereas 5 years ago, when I started my work with the military, I was chasing people. Now they're coming after me, not because, and I don't even serve in the military. I was raised in the military, but not served in the military. So I think if I look, and I love what everything that Mike is doing, because it's just phenomenal. And it's more comprehensive. My dream would be that the TTPs that I share with anybody would ultimately get them so they get to spend a weekend at the farm and that their life has changed, or they get to embrace and get into a clinical setting when they need to, or they're like, you know what, I am going to do 12 step. So part of my desire is and I remind people this, you don't need to take a class, you don't need to take a course, you don't need to have initials past your name, you don't need to have a certification to make a difference in another human being's life. You don't. You can be that tipping point. You can be. And it's fascinating to me. I got to tell this funny story. So I go to the Pentagon, never been to the Pentagon. I'm just like, I'm overwhelmed. This is, what the heck am I doing here? Goofy me. For me, that's 35,000 people to make connection with. Between the brief and then the meeting and these other things, I'm walking around. I know rank. I know what's in the middle of people's chest. So hi, Admiral. Hi, Colonel. I'm just saying hi to people. Just, the reciprocity. I feel good when I say hi, and I So at the end of the day, my handlers, I called Samantha. She was with me all day. So the days ended. We've been together for like 8 hours. She said, "Sir, Mr. Bartley, can I say something?" I said, "Sure, absolutely." She said, "Sir, I've worked in this building for 9 years. 9 years. I've never seen that many people smile ever." I'm like, so I'm telling you, you don't think people, like, heaven
Yeah.
forbid I know their name, because which is really, quite frankly, is my forte. Heaven forbid I know their name, but like, that's an amazing statement to me. And it's not me, it's God, quite frankly, but just people's hunger for recognition. And that might be that one small thing, and it's not nirvana. I mean, there's science on this. That might be the one small thing that gets somebody to the more formal and brilliant and established things that Mike's talking about. So I look as, I want to be the feeder to Mike's programs. Let me get the people who think, all right, damn, just this thing. Okay, well then let me try something that's more formal that then can help, take apart the rape, the domestic violence, the financial devastation, the homelessness, all these other things, that if we can get somebody to that point. So that's really what I'm trying to do, is to equip people with simplicity so that an individual, a unit, a division reaches a tipping point where then the commanders and brother, I'm going to talk about officers who are hanging out in BH, when they don't, just there to talk to people. Man, I'm like, my God, that is a freaking brilliant. And I'm also using the blue sock story too. Say, what? Because I'll have young guys come up to me and just say, "Hey, do you ever feel like, it's hard to conform?" I'm like, "Look, do not tell anybody I said this." But I got a great friend of mine who's Force Recon Marine, who in 20 years always wore blue socks.
Yeah, that's it. The state of human.
Heck yeah, man. I'm feeling that, brother. Absolutely, man. That's a different TTP. We might not do a slide on that one.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. So let's look over the horizon a little bit. Let's assume and let's dream as if everything that we've talked about has been implemented, and gaps have been filled in the collaboration side of things, culture has been shifted and everything. What does it look like to have a mentally, physically, socially, and spiritually resilient military? Like, what would it mean for the future of the U.S. military to have such a fighting force? What would change? What would be the thing that we're looking ahead to and building ourselves toward as a result of all this?
That's
Brother,
resiliency.
you go first.
That's resiliency.
Please.
That's readiness. That's redeployability. That's everything. In order to get there, what I've found through a lot of the education that we've given is, as we were teaching kind of like, Mickey Mouse style. Through a lot of the prevention programs, I was teaching that if he gives his Xbox away, there's a red flag, but how many people knew somebody gave their Xbox away? And so what we actually ended up teaching, and the reason I want to explain this is because if the force could understand this, then just how much more lethal we can be as warfighters in relation to resiliency, readiness, just like with the Marine Corps and the Army with their TCCC program. What makes us so lethal in war is the fact that you can shoot us and we are still going to fight because our corpsmen and our medics can just patch us and we keep running. We're invincible, right? And so if we're invincible physically, if you can literally shoot us and we can keep fighting, then we should be able to do the same mentally. And so one of the things that we teach is we discuss the impacts that trauma has on the brain. And the reason that we do that is the exact same reason that you would teach somebody to become an expert of a weapon system before they go deploy. I don't expect them to learn to shoot in the middle of combat. I expect them to learn everything about this weapon system prior to combat, to where when they get in combat and their adrenaline kicks in and all their fine motor skills and tactile goes away, they can still operate this weapon system because they've done it over and over and over and over again in training. I want the exact same thing done with the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to do that, I want them to understand that the prefrontal cortex, the upstairs of the brain, and the limbic region, the downstairs of the brain, they have to understand both of those and how trauma impacts both. So the limbic region is where fight or flight, your sympathetic nervous system, things like that, that's your survival instinct. All right. The upstairs brain, that's your prefrontal cortex. That's your personality, your emotional regulation, your decision making, and all of those things. Well, somebody that has experienced trauma has less access to the prefrontal cortex because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until the mid to late 20s. The limbic region is developed within the first 2 years of life, which is why a 2-year-old can not have a popsicle in a hot tub and throw a temper tantrum for an hour and a half because they don't understand that why can I not have this popsicle in a hot tub, and they drop down into that volcano response of fight or flight and anger, irrational outburst, right? Well, someone who experiences trauma can't access the prefrontal cortex as much because what happens is every time that they experience trauma, it becomes less accessible and harder to stay in. So we call it the meta state up top. So it's harder to stay in there and it's less accessible. So in someone who has never experienced trauma, if you're where I am right now in Stafford, Virginia, and you hear a big explosion, my brain is going to be right here. I'm going to drop down into my limbic region. My limbic region, the fight or flight, is going to say, what is that? Is that danger? And then my brain's going to say, no, that's not danger. You're near Stafford, and they train artillery all the time, and you're safe. And I'm going to come back up close to my prefrontal cortex and be regulated. But somebody who doesn't have that access and that ability to bounce back, and that all happens within 20 seconds to 2 minutes, right? Somebody who has experienced a lot of trauma, when that happens, will drop down and their brain can't determine whether this is an emergency, whether this is a threat. And so therefore, subconsciously, they react as a threat. They become irritable. They become angry. And they have these outbursts, which are reactions to trauma. Now, as I'm down there and I'm dealing with this, all of a sudden I spill my coffee, or my kid spills a drink, or something else happens, and things keep happening, and I get stuck in this perpetual state of fight or flight, and I never actually come back to get regulated. And that's what happens with individuals that experience childhood trauma, and then we make that complex trauma by them experiencing more trauma when they are in the military. So now they have complex trauma, which literally rewires the brain to make it less accessible to the prefrontal cortex. So what do? Now they're in this bottom limbic region, the basement of your brain, and they're stuck in this survival state. And it could be subconscious. It could be a smell. It could be a sound. Could be something they saw. They don't even realize it affects them. It's not always as obvious as an explosion. But now they're stuck down in this state where they're lashing out at their family. They're having these angry outbursts and they're irrational and they can't figure out why. And so what do? They then turn to alcohol. They turn to pills. They turn to sex. They turn to the gym, but in a bad way, like lifting until I can't feel anything, or go running until I pass out. And they have these unhealthy coping mechanisms. Well, what happens with that is your brain imprints that. And so now every time you have any little bit of stress, an unexpected bill comes up in the mail, you drop down into that stress response and your brain says, go drink. Your brain says, take the pill, go have sex, go work out until you can't feel anything. And that keeps happening. So all that to say, if we can understand that and how we get there and how those effects happen, if our leaders, all the way down to our junior leaders, can understand the effects that trauma has on its brain, then we can face the problem. Then we could say, okay, we know that I've experienced childhood things, so how do I get ahead of it? Well, therapy. By every book that has been written so far, the only way to rewire the brain is through neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is done through talk therapy. Medications will help you get over the hump to be able to have a good quality therapy session, but medications aren't always the end-all be-all. We have to get the brain rewired in a way where we have more access to that prefrontal cortex. And it's not all doom and gloom. We can access it again, but explaining that, having our leaders understand the effects that it has on the brain, not just the impacts to the individual, not just, oh, he's dealing with something. Like, what is he dealing with? Why is he dealing with it? It's affecting his brain. And then we can get them the right resources to get them ready again. And I don't mean to keep going, David, but one last thing, and I can't remember his name, and I'm sad that I can't, but there was a Medal of Honor recipient, and he had this there was this day where he just did the Medal of Honor run, fought off a bunch of individuals by holding down a machine gun position, just did all of the things and got a Medal of Honor. And they pulled him from combat and put him on a road show to go around and talk about his experience. Well, all he would talk about was the next day. So he was the biggest hero and everybody was talking about his story. But the next day, his platoon got mortared and he fell in a hole and couldn't react. He went numb, couldn't move. And he just laid there. And he said he felt like a coward. And it was a major moral injury on him. And so that's the other thing, is we don't get to pick and choose how trauma affects us. So sometimes trauma affects us in a sense that we become angry, irrational, and go do a Medal of Honor run. But sometimes it can make us freeze and have a fawn response and be completely locked up and not be able to function. And the biggest thing leaders can do is take a morally neutral perspective to that, understanding that it's not good, bad, right, or wrong. It just is. It's just morally neutral, that these reactions to trauma and what these folks are dealing with from their past to now is no fault to their own. And we need to take that perspective and try to get them the help that they need to get them ready and get them redeployable, rather than just say, hey, that's a problem. Let's push it on someone else. And, maybe they'll get out of the military and I can move on in my direction. That's my thoughts on where we're headed and what it would look like and what I think we need to do to get there.
Mike is spot on 100%. And because I think, the whole trauma part is more, that's much more clinical, and I'm not really qualified except having been experienced it. And one thing though, I would share with both of you, and I think Brett, I might've shared this with you, Mike, I've never shared this with you, not that I was hiding it, so I've done 45 sessions of ECT, of electroconvulsive therapy. And it has been phenomenal. And so I would think that is one additional way, in addition to, I did this on one of my slides, a rough calculation, well over 500 hours of individual therapy, 500 hours of group therapy, and then 45 sessions of ECT over 2 years. And all my ECT was ketamine infused as well. And it was phenomenal. And my wife will share with you the change, especially in the last 6 months, what ECT has done in addition to the other things in terms of the rewiring has been phenomenal. It's been absolutely amazing to me. And, ECT is so it's so misunderstood. It's vastly underutilized, and the efficacy rate is incredibly high. So I'm actually tomorrow doing some filming with the hospital. It's a psych hospital where I've gone for the last 2 years for these sessions, to do some promotional things and to make myself available if anybody wants to talk about ECT, because it's helpful for depression and schizophrenia and OCD and all kinds of things. So yeah, and if you ever have somebody, brother, who's like, maybe I'd like some information, don't ever hesitate to refer them to me. You can give them my number. I'm happy to talk to them and just say, hey man, this is, because I've only met one other person that's done more sessions than me. I met a guy who's done 101. Most of the time it's like 6 to 8. Yeah, I know. 6 to 8 sessions. So, but 45, I've never met anybody.
How much therapy you can do, and that's not I can think of worse competitions to have than how much therapy you can use.
Yeah, man, it has been amazing. It's a shocking experience.
Go ahead, Mike.
A lot of the things we're talking about have been written about, just kind of the direction that this conversation went. And I cannot remember his name. It's David something. It's driving me crazy that I can't remember his name. But the books are On Killing and then On Killing Remotely. And the book On Killing Remotely is specifically about the drone operators and things like that. Just wanted to mention that because those are great resources if people are looking for more to read on some of these things, because nothing we're saying here is, newfound material. This is just reaffirming material that has already been discussed, just nobody's implementing it. On Killing is a wonderful book.
I found the author of that really quick. You can find that on Amazon, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Phelps, On Killing and On Killing Remote.
Okay. So those books right there would be great resources to dive into for this. He dives really big before the remotely into the Vietnam veterans and kind of some of the struggles that they dealt with coming back, and specifically the moral injuries that they had. even the ones that there were moral injuries from, I didn't get to kill. I joined to kill and didn't get to. I didn't get to see combat and some of the effects that had on individuals. So super interesting.
It is. Yeah. Wow.
We'll get back to that conversation in just a minute, but I have a quick question for you. Do you know anyone who's working to improve other people's lives who perhaps aren't getting the credit or the recognition that they deserve? Reach out to me and I would love to feature them in this podcast. Thanks. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you might be interested to learn of some other resources that we've made available to you. Look up benniscompanies.com and you will find books, podcasts, and other resources that we've been developing to help you live a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. All right, back to it. All right, I have about 3 profiles and I'd like to essentially position this as you two are brought into a team and you are sitting in a room and you are going to be helping these 3 different hypothetical individuals. And I basically want to take 5 or 6 minutes for each person and just kind of give your perspective on how you two can come together and bring someone who's in this situation some hope and maybe an idea of the way forward, a sense, like you said earlier, David, of being seen, felt, heard, accepted, that sort of thing, and giving them an understanding. What are their next couple steps that they might find some forward momentum in their situation? So first one is a Captain Ramirez who commands a unit where she has begun to notice a worrying pattern where she's seen increased isolation, increased self-harm incidents, and escalating disruption of discipline among her troops. She's trying to figure out what's going on. She's trying to figure out how to help them. But how does Captain Ramirez begin to start addressing the situation and shifting the culture without causing panic or breaking trust? Or like Mike said earlier, coming off as a hypocrite, but actually making some progress in shifting the culture of her unit.
Do you want to start, Dave?
So I'll go first. Yeah, mine's because I'm really moving towards you, brother. And anyway, so I would ask Captain Ramirez, say, okay, not ignoring the negative things, but break down the components and the ingredients, the people, the time of day, the activities, whatever they are, when things are at their best. And I like to keep it. I don't want to say when they're good, because that's a more difficult, that's a more strict definition. So when I say at their best is going to allow her to have an interpretation of, well, what is at their best for her? So then say, okay, well, this person is involved and this is what we're doing. And there's going to be some ingredients that are consistent when things are at their best. So identify and then say, all right, let's assume that that's where you would like things to be. So then if you can look at, okay, because patterns exist. So if we can determine what the pattern is, and then the second thing would be, I would direct it to asking her some questions about her to say, okay, what's going on when you're at your best? Like what's happening? Okay. And then I'd ask her, okay, what's going on when opposite of that? Not when you're at your worst. What's it when you feel at the opposite of that? Just to see, because the interesting thing is Captain Ramirez is the common denominator to when things are positive and when things are negative. She is in both of those situations. While other people may be involved, she's the central cast. So just say, okay, what's to determine what's happening in her life. So I'd go down that way. But again, to keep it not like you're thinking of killing yourself and stay out of good and bad. What's going on when you're at your best? What's going on when you're not? And then the other questions that I tend to ask are, okay, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And so there'd be a series of questions that I would ask, very open-ended to get an idea of determining what's going on for her and then what's happening when the unit she feels is at their best. And I think those 2 questions will yield some information, and then we could actually break down, okay, how about if we not like the whole thing is just a CF, but let's isolate what the individual aspects are that are quote unquote problematic and address those. So that would be my approach. Very unscientific, more investigative, but in a way it's not your traditional questions to try to kind of outflank what I look at as the enemy, because I want to do just to try something different.
Mike, how would you build off of that?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, he's really diving into what are the leaders doing and what kind of essentially what example are they setting? Are they setting an example that is congruent with this, or are we setting an example that is opposite of this? And so when you look at these things, a lot of times they're there's a few contributing factors that you can kind of pinpoint and deal with. So if this is newfound information, right? Like let's say I'm gonna make an assumption here that she's been in command here for a while, things were normal for a while, and now they're not. And so if that's the case, there was a turning point somewhere, something happens. And typically what you find that turning point is some sort of moral injury, whether on an individual, but a lot of times if you see a moral injury on an individual, depending on how the command responds to said moral injury, leads to moral injury throughout the command. So case in point, an individual is sexually assaulted within the command. We tell the individual, hey, you shouldn't have been at that party. You shouldn't have put yourself in that situation, and we do nothing about it. Well, the entire command is looking at you through a magnifying glass to see how you're going to handle this situation. If we handle that situation like that, the entire command, you just lost. And so this goes back to trust. You just lost all of their trust. They don't trust you. And now you're back to that nonconformity. Everything that they're doing is just trying to be different. They're trying to break norms. They're trying to get away. But what led you there and what caused that? And so I think a full-on command climate survey would be and do, but I think diving in and trying to find the head of this and figure out what we could do differently and what we could address about the situation that potentially happened. Another contributing factor to a command like this is often an individual leader. So it's not necessarily a command culture. Sometimes it is, and that's a struggle because that will go all the way to the top. And a lot of time that is a culture that is led, as David was speaking to, as that starts at the top, because truly that commander builds the culture of the entire command. But a lot of times outside of that, you can also really hone in on individual small level or small unit leadership and find that one individual that is creating such turmoil. Now, if this is throughout the whole command, then yes, you're looking at a whole command thing. Or it could just be a higher ranking individual that's creating this. But if you have somebody that is doing nothing to build trust, that is doing nothing to support these Marines, sailors, soldiers, and it is all about work for the organization and the machine, but they don't feel supported, they don't feel heard, that is another pinpoint area where I would look for, is trying to identify where that one is. And you'll see these generational impacts of this. When one command is affected by a situation like I just described with that sexual assault, it's usually 4 generations of that command that is affected by those decisions that are made. And so it could be something like that within this command. What you really need to do is address it. And then you need to make sure that we don't replicate those decisions in the future and we go out of our way to show that we're working hard not to, and that we do support them.
That's awesome. And I just want to throw in one quick resource. My wife is a retiring Army officer, and she's been in command a couple times. And there's one really important book that she shared with me, which is the Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. And one of the basic premises of the book is essentially like cultural changes like this, or even just functional, like operating. If you're just trying to make sure your unit operates at a higher level, much less comes back from something that is something like Mike talked about, recovering from that kind of organizational trauma. Everything that you do, especially as a leader, happens at the speed of trust. So if you don't have the trust of the people, if there isn't trust in your organization, things break down. But the more trust you build through things like Mike was saying, of how you respond to those events, how you respond to the soldier who gets in trouble or the event that happens, you build the trust in your organization is able to work at essentially a higher level. Second profile is during a deployment. Alex is currently deployed in an active war zone. For the last few weeks, he's been feeling increasingly overwhelmed, on edge, and mentally exhausted. His thoughts are starting to spiral, but he's keeping to himself. He's worried that speaking up could make him look like the weak link, or hurt his team, or lead to retaliation. He knows something isn't right, but doesn't see a safe way forward. How would you two sit down and help with someone in Alex's position?
Brother, I'm gonna have you go first because I don't have any experience going down range.
So these situations are tricky. They're certainly tricky, and they're tricky because he doesn't want to speak up because there's so many things you can do on deployment to be viewed weak. within your formation. And that's the end all be all. No one ever wants to be perceived as weak, which is why there's so much stigma and why there's so many that don't speak up. As a leader, what you should do in this situation is again, educate yourself early on, like I said earlier. So we don't learn to shoot in the middle of combat. We don't learn the brain. We don't learn the mind. We don't learn these signs and symptoms in the middle of it. We learn it before. So these things are, I should be able to identify this. But also, if I've been building trust and rapport with those under my command, then I should be having these regular conversations where he should be comfortable opening up and telling me. But I also would rely heavily on my lower level leaders, your NCOs and your junior staff that can have these conversations and trust that if something like this is brought up, that they'll bring it up to you. So now how to address it, to your question. What I like to do in these situations is make me the problem, not him, right? I can never come out and be like, hey, we're going to sit John down because John can't handle it right now, or John's tired, so John needs a break. No, it's John, I need you to handle something else right now. I'm sorry, and let him act mad, right? Let him be mad about it, but reorient the focus of what his mission is on, where you're the bad guy. You're the one that's taking it, but have the understanding that, hey, I know you needed a break, but we don't even need to talk about that. Now, what I will talk about is afterwards, go in and say, hey, so what's really going on? Have that intrusive conversation, sure. But in front of the team, in front of the formation, we need to pull that guy, but pull him in a way that is not pulling for a break, pull in a way that is a reorient of mission for right now. One thing we did in Iraq a lot was there were some easier duties. Nobody really wanted them. Nobody wanted to work at the chow hall. No one really wanted to work in the gym, but we had to keep you gainfully employed. I can't say just hang out and take a nap all day. But these are easier duties, and a lot of times guys would gripe and complain about them, but you knew deep down this was the best thing for them for the next 2 weeks because of what they were exposed to, what they dealt with, the work schedule. Hey, I need you to check ID cards at the gym for 2 weeks. And deep down he's going, yes, I get a break. But that way he has plausible deniability in front of his buddies when they say, oh, you're trying to get out of patrol. No, the boss made me do this. I didn't want to do this. So that's how I like to handle those situations.
So Mike, that's how you would handle it a little bit if you were in position of a leadership over someone like Alex. David, how would you kind of advise Alex to navigate?
So I did this,
his own situation.
Yeah. And I did this in all of my briefs, when I talked about that. So I used the quote when I come out to explain what caused me. How do you go from running a nationally recognized end of life animal sanctuary to you're going to jump off a 730-foot tall bridge? And I talk about the trauma and everything else. And then I was told not to talk about it. And Maya Angelou, and I think Mike, I think you both will agree with this, where she says, there's no greater agony than bearing the weight of an untold story. And I said that it'll kill you. And so at this point in all my briefs, the last couple of weeks, I paused and I said, hey, if anybody here, a brother or sister, is carrying the weight of an untold story, and certainly there was going to be at least one in every brief. And this is to answer your question, Brett, for in this case, Alex, I'd say, hey, do this. Find the person that you trust the most. But you have to set it up. You got to create it this way, that you go to the person and you say, hey, I have something I need to share with you that's really important. I don't need advice. I don't need suggestions. I don't need tips. I don't need any of that. I need you just to please just listen and be present for me. Will you do that? And I said, I'm 63. I said, 63 years on the planet, a person will do that. And I said, I don't know to what extent sharing that will relieve you of this weight that you have been carrying, this untold story for however long that is. It'll be something. And I say, I don't want you to have carried it as long as I did. And so that would be my suggestion to Alex, is just to pick a person who they trust. But the thing is, it's really essential is they set it up correctly to the person so that you manage the listening to just say, I don't need what I know you probably want to do is to give me suggestions and tips and advice and everything else. I don't need that. I need you just to listen. So that would be my suggestion. And then ideally, what Mike's talking about at a more organizational level, which is brilliant, to do those other two things together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know that, like Mike said earlier, preparing ahead of time for someone who maybe is getting ready to deploy, that whether you're on the receiving end or whether you're on the end of managing the situation, that can be really helpful. So thank you both. One last one, and then we'll wrap this section up. This is now post-deployment. Sam is an active duty service member who recently returned from deployment with his unit. Since coming home, his unit has not been as close as they were, and he's noticed a close friend and teammate becoming increasingly withdrawn, irritable, and disconnected. His friend brushes things off and insists he's fine, but Sam senses something is wrong, and he's worried about saying the wrong thing, betraying trust, or maybe pushing him over the edge, and he's unsure how to help, but he wants to do something. How would you counsel Sam, David, and Mike?
I'm going back to you again.
So in those situations, that's one of the biggest problems that everyone has. This isn't just military. That the problem of I recognize an issue but I don't address it. Of fear of the response. Time and time and if everyone could hear the things that I've heard of, man, I wish I'd have said something. I wish I'd have done something. I wish I'd have done more. I wish I'd have asked him. We don't want to live with that. You want to address it because a lot of times that's all it takes. When I was struggling with alcohol, I can't tell you how many times that I honestly wished somebody just asked. Like, hey, man, how much are you drinking? God told him, like, I'm drinking every night. I need help. But I was never going to come out and say it. And so a lot of times that addressing that situation is exactly what that individual needs. But it takes so much courage, and people don't feel like they're adequate to have that conversation. They're scared about what's going to come, because what if he does say, I'm considering killing myself? Well, now what? Did I pay attention to my briefs? Do I know where to take him? Do I know what to do? Do I need to rush him to the ER? Do I need to, tackle him and hold him down? Like, no, when somebody's considering suicide, as long as they're not considering doing it right now and don't have a plan and they're not trying, like, this is the time that we wrap our arm around and we show them we care. We show them the support. We get them to the right resources, not the ER, but some of our counseling and some of our things that we can provide these resources to and be that support network that they need. So many times you see someone that doesn't speak up and the guilt that they carry forever because of that. We recently, same colonel actually, someone was leaving work and he walked by her and didn't say anything. And that's off, right? So anybody who's watching, like, obviously if you walk by a colonel, you say good morning or good afternoon. They didn't say anything and they looked down. And she was familiar with this Marine. And so she said, hey, instead of letting it go like she could have and like most would, hey, whatever, he's dealing with something. I'm not going to, bother him. She said, hey, come here. Let's sit down and talk. Tell me what's going on. That was unlike you. And he starts crying and says, I was actually walking over to the train station. I was going to jump in front of the train. Right then, that little, hey, come over here and let's talk real quick, just saved his life. And so definitely, like, have the courage to speak up whenever you think something. And a lot of times these conversations that we end up having are superficial. I go out of my way instead of like, hey, how are you today? Good. And you? And then I move on. No. I stop and the follow-on question, because that's where the truth comes out. The follow-on question is, hey, how are you really? Hey, shut the door. How's things at home? What's really going on? How's your wife doing? And have that eye to eye, sit at the same level that they're at and dive into, a real conversation. Because what was his name? This wasn't Alex. This was someone else. He would open up. Sam. Hopefully the hope is that with that conversation, Sam would open up and would tell you. And you could get him to the resources that he needs to get to. Yeah.
I do it one of two ways. What Mike had talked about is just to come and just say, hey, man, I could be totally off base, but this is what I'm feeling in regards to our relationship right now. Again, I could be totally wrong. It's more important for me to share this and be wrong than it would be to not say something. The other way to do it would be, and this is actually kind of Mike had alluded to this in our first scenario, would say, hey, man, do you have a moment to speak? Sure. I say, hey, I got this friend and we had really been tight, when we were downrange. And since we've come back, I feel like he and I are disconnected. Do you have any suggestions on, should I say something to him? Is there, what do you think? So obviously I'm being fictitious, but maybe that's, 1 degree outside of the problem where the guy would say, oh yeah, man, no, you should do this, or "No, you don't say anything at all." Or, so I think one of those 2 ways would be the way I would approach it.
Awesome. Well, David and Mike, this has been an amazing conversation. I think it's an incredibly important topic. One, just because the population is so big that we're dealing with, and it's so prevalent. Like you said, Mike, I think you said something like 93% of military members have like a high ACEs score, or would have a high ACEs score. But not only because it's such a big population, but also because it's one of the most powerful forces in the world is the U.S. military. It's massive, and the amount of influence and the amount of things that we affect, and that bring into that all of the families and all of the different things going on and all the veteran population. There's a massive amount of people who have experienced things like what you guys have talked about, you guys have addressed. And I love that we have delved into, like, there's definitely a gap, and there's definitely there's a ways to go, but there's progress being made. And there are people out there in the military, high up in the military, and people who are helping the military, doing good things, setting up new structures, setting up new ways of doing it, trying to learn. And so I love that, yes, we acknowledge that the situation isn't what it could be in the future, but there are people doing good things, and you two are doing good things in this population. To say thank you for that. Thank you for what you guys are doing, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Don't forget to check out the links in the description to see some other resources that we've made available to you, and leave a comment below on what stood out to you most about this conversation, or what types of conversations you'd like to see more of in the future. Thanks. Bye.